This presentation attempts to capture some laboratory work in the field of thought on the unusual attempt to combine several um, chemical elements, remembering that actually, as it turns out in so many instances, um, science turns out to be something that retreats from us almost endlessly, like this. It's a cultural practice like Der Abgrund, like Nietzsche's abyss. It's something that stares back into us. We take it very seriously. It becomes us. We treat it as um, what is most solid under under our under our feet. And so when we do an experiment like this with what we take to be the basic chemical elements, and then we find out. Um, so Hasek Chang was one of maybe the leading, probably the best actually in the world, historian of science. Has written a book called something along the lines of "Is H2O water?" So if we formulate the matter in an exact way, scientifically, do we from that, as it were, get instructions on how to comprise water physically? And he says no, because actually, if you just have um, one hydrogen molecule, strictly speaking, by some standard, you'd have to give or take some number of atoms or something. You'd have to stipulate it somehow. Some issues would come in. But it was by some standard, we strictly speaking have one molecule of hydrogen and two um, molecules of oxygen, and meet the definition in some way that we can consistently keep with, so we can fit the initial stipulations of Aristotelian logic of having something that is identical to itself, such that it can then figure in speech which speaks of contradiction, or saying the thing that doesn't seem to make sense, taking it, remembering, so we should remember that Socrates, Platon, uh, have initially, are prior to this logic. We should remember Socrates and Plato are prior to the so-called metaphysics. So far as metaphysics means the same thing as first philosophy, or the so-called laws of thought. So how, in other words, logic in the hard sense, rather than logic in the sense where it has to come into contact with. There's two choices. You could say there's Platonic lie logic, which means logic in the hard sense always has to be juxtaposed against logic in terms of we have to deal with the real world and the real situation, and how people and how much we can explain to other people, and only a few people can really sensu stricto grasp logic in the hard sense, and handle this. And then you get some sort of doofuses like Sam Harris or something that pretend to be representatives of this part of this mystical part of the community that can actually, speaking ironically, but this part of the community that can actually deal with, according to themselves, deal with this deal with these strict rules of logic, identity, contradiction, and Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell was far more intelligent than Sam Harris, in my opinion. But he couldn't see the answers himself. He had some problems, and he stuck with what he thought. I think at the end of his life, he actually admitted that there was something to Heidegger after having, for many decades, struggled with Heidegger. Bertrand Russell is very intelligent, but people like Harris, I think, they just imitate this stance, and moreover, they kind of believe their own hype, which is even more pathetic. But so the point being that we already have, in the first beginning of thought, this juxtaposition between a kind of you have to answer the question. The public is coming forward saying, what's all the talk about Alexander Dugin about, or what's all the talk about the awakening, the so-called Great Awakening, rather than the Davos Great Reset. And then there has to be an answer. So either there has to be an answer that everyone can in some way take part of. So this is the historically, Christianity is probably the first message of this kind, but now we're making a generic category and transferring it on the past. But it has a certain sense in saying this, is that it was something that bridged the highest elites, including the emperor, although there was, of course, usually a split between the emperor and some kind of patriarch, or either the patriarch of Constantinople or something similar, or the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope. Bishop of Rome and the Pope being the same thing. Or some other high bishopric in Alexandria or someplace. Or in Jerusalem, I think, also is one of the big centers of Christendom. Christendom, by the way, has a term. It's useful to think of it this way. Prior to the 1930s, when the term racism came in connection to the social Darwinism, as it was made, as the already existing American and British sort of Fabian Society versions existed, were made more visible when somebody that we didn't like was doing the same thing. And then the term racism came in connection to biological racism, which Heidegger is strongly against, by the way, in which Dugin, being a profound student of Heidegger, is also profoundly against. We get this situation where there's a question of what space does the theory of the perfect logic of the small proportion of people who go beyond what everyone can understand to a specialized subject, how strong a role should that play? That becomes something very, very important in the whole tradition. We should see in this current reflection just a chance of how we can move into the spirit as against the body or form of things, in the sense that if I take all the parts or the totality of, say, a tree, it doesn't appear that well in the video, but I can see a tree from here, an oak with all its branches full of tiny little leaves tingling at their edges. We could take it apart piece by piece, just like that molecule of water, and then we could ask if from just the parts do we actually get this thing that's called an oak tree. So in Hosek Chang, the issue is that actually extra particles of different kinds need to come in that aren't accounted for strictly by the one hydrogen and the two oxygen molecules. But in this case, it's a different... so see how we're already dealing in a super subtle level where we have to understand distinctions that not everyone could understand, and then there's a certain credibility for saying, oh, some people are more gifted in this type of reflection, and maybe this type of reflection is of some importance to human beings as a whole, and therefore there's a justification for this distinction between what Dugin can communicate to everyone on Earth and what he can only communicate to certain people, and in the same way between people who claim to be intelligent and people who claim to be stupid. I mean, supposing somebody would come out and actually boast to be stupid. Usually, everyone thinks themselves wise in a certain way, or at least in the sense they know their own existential condition in a certain way, with certain extreme exceptions. But usually, in the case of a well, okay, I don't want to qualify that any further. Usually, in the case of an adult, I think maybe in adolescence it would be less likely, but to get back to the example of the tree being broken up into parts, we never get to the tree from breaking it into the parts. All the parts are either some generic matter or they're parts of the whole tree. And then you get this question of the one and the many and the universal and all these kind of questions which can't necessarily obviously be brought out as to why they're important for daily life, except that you go through a long chain of reflections. And we find here why in the East the temples, it makes no difference to people that the temple, like the Isa temple, one of these old shrines, these Shinto shrines, which are mainly made out of wood, more easily replaceable material, were often rebuilt seasonally because it simply didn't have the idea of identity as connected to totality, in the sense as connected to the idea of a material cause. Because whenever they rebuilt the temple, it was they did not have the idea of the duplicate. So this idea that was brought to a head in Walter Benjamin's oft mentioned work on the reproduction. Material reproduction. So this age of infinite reproduction of the form of the thing nonetheless wasn't really inquired into in Japan in the same way as it was by the Aristotelian, and one could say even by the Socratic or Platonic, in the question of the one and the many. Looking at that question, we see how spirit is something actually efficacious, because it must be that spirit, or the Geistische, is that which is juxtaposed to that material congeries of things which makes up the material object. It's in this way that Dugin, who doesn't have JDAM bombs or quarter-ton bombs, munitions, but only has this thing like John Austin has said in his, actually I think it's posthumously published, How to Do Things with the Words, a teacher of, I think it's like UC Berkeley, I don't know, we have some like Scottish guy or something now, but there's basically there was John Searle was the big analytic philosopher, and he was a student of there was another guy that was a teacher of Heidegger too, who was also Hubert Dreyfus, who was also who was a face-blind man who was also big on Heidegger, but I think Searle was more famous, exerted more influence. So this Chinese room argument is arguments against consciousness being transferred to an artificial intelligence. And his teacher, John Austin, came out with the book How to Do Things with Words, which was a theory of efficacious speech. So it's this efficacious speech is like This is like the analytic version of the question of what is Geist? What is Hegelian Geist? It's this Geistige thing which they call efficacious speech. Efficacious speech. So it's speech which is an action. In 1962, I think. So I think he had died in 1960. That book came out. And this How to Do Things with Speech, doesn't it actually speak then to this space where the tree itself is? The space that is not the totality of things, which is not the empirical scientific object. Parenthetical phrase, yes, empirical is a radically contested word since the time of Hume, and it actually corresponds to the word epistemology, because before that there's something called episteme, which is part of the divided line of Plato and so on. But it corresponds to the notion of a theory of the necessity of theory of knowledge, because it would have been before Hume, many things were taken for granted, which once contested couldn't be forgotten, and became part of the Der Abgrund that stares back into us, part of the abyss of Nietzsche, that when we stare too long and it stares back at us and we take it as a fate. So it's here where Dugin is firing his JDAM bombs, or his motions, in the midst of the current Rasputitsa, the muddy season, the unpassable season. And so I just want to end this with a code of thinking. Is it totally superficial to make this comparison between Rasputin, who contributed, I think, some mystical ideas to the theory of de Vattel, of the non-interventionism, so like that it would be illegal for the CIA to intervene into the Maidan Square in 2014, just as it would be illegal for Saudi Arabia to pay some tens of billions of dollars to General Sisi to stage a coup against the lawfully elected Muslim Brotherhood, who had the belief in Muslim universality rather than the belief that the former Ottomans were to be forever separated from the Arabs. Remember, in the Arab uprising after the end of the Ottoman Empire for freedom against the Ottomans. We should think that this is a moment when guidance, which can be immediately understood as how to be, as what things are, as what the tree is, as something different than the material guidance, can be efficacious. And I think it's in this sense that Zizek is terrified of Dugin and won't speak to him.